sustainability of urban environments and remote sensing analysis of urban expansion, and investigating the impacts of what's called ecosystem service values. And this is done jointly by myself and Jingxiang Liu, who was my PhD student a few years ago and currently working in Perth. So the content I want to cover was firstly the fact that half of the world's population is now living in cities and urban areas, and the populations are increasing. Then I want to just mention sustainable development. What is it? And also the definition of indicators that we may use to determine whether development is sustainable. Question, what's the future of urbanization and sustainability of modern cities? Giving an example of how the developments have occurred in China. Then the importance of green space and the effect of fragmentation of ecosystems due to the loss of green space in the environment. And then we look at the fragmentation that's occurred with two examples using Earth observation data in Wuhan and Sydney. And then finally, look at the impact of urban development.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Please share your screen.
Yeah, we cannot see your screen, so maybe you can share your screen.
Oh, we can't see
Well,
you.
I had shared before.
Yeah, please press the share screen again.
Where? Wait a minute. How do I do that?
At the bottom of your screen, there are these controls, and in the middle, there is this green up arrow that says share screen.
This with the green here.
When you push that arrow, you can select the screen you would like to share.
I had it shared before. I was told that it was visible.
So there is
Do I have to
a
look at-
share screen button, the bottom of the panel.
I don't see it. Oh, okay, right. Now I can see you.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes. So
You're
just
already-
yes,
Share
just go again to the PowerPoint.
PowerPoint again. Yes.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
And I just need to go into the presentation mode.
Yeah,
Okay,
perfect.
perfect, perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Just the second slide was what I just covered about the number of people that are now living in urban areas, which is more than half the population. Sustainability indicators. What's the future of urbanization and sustainability of modern cities? The importance of green space, fragmentation, and the impact of developments on ecosystem service values, which is a big topic these days amongst the environmentalists. So as far as the constraints on human developments are concerned, there's been the World Summit of Sustainable Development in 2002, which identified the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which are economic, social, and environmental protection. And in 2015, there was a decision by 194 countries of the UN to adopt the 2030 development agenda entitled Transformation of Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And then we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of those. I'm not going to go over them, but they should be a cornerstone of the developments that are occurring as far as urban areas are concerned. And goal number 11 particularly identifies urban areas. So sustainable development, I just want to identify a couple of definitions. That means adoption of practices of environmental use and management which provide for satisfactory standards of living today and which will not impair the capacity to provide the future generations. And this is the real question. How do we ensure that that happens? How do we know that our level of development is going to impact on the environment to the extent that it will not satisfy the needs of future generations? And another definition, development that meets the needs of the present without foreclosing the needs of the options of future generations. And I do ask the question later on, how do we define sustainable development of cities? So it requires equilibrium between production and the consumption of energy, and it cannot be divorced from satisfying issues of equity, welfare, lifestyle, and standards of living. So sustainability indicators have been talked about for a long time, at least 20, 30 years, and they're developed to monitor the progress and assess the impacts of policy on natural resource development. They're often reduced to exact measures of single factors and their combination in meaningful parameters, compress information, a relatively complex process into simple measures, maybe application specific, sensitive to change, convenient to communicate and collect, and separate sustainability indicators are usually set for economic, social, and ecological. And if you look at the sustainability indicators, a large proportion of them have been established for economic and social, and very few of them for the ecological. So how sustainable are cities? How do we know what a sustainable city is? We need to look to the future and decide whether our current actions are sustainable. There are no satisfactory indices that would be suitable for cities. And the indices should consider the three components of sustainability and include the effects of neighbouring areas, particularly areas nearby cities, which are often used as well as the cities themselves for provision of services. Should the assessment of sustainability in both development and developing countries be absolute criteria and considers total environmental impacts and or eco-efficiency as a threshold criterion. So these are perhaps the way in which we can try to determine how we can decide how our cities are sustainable. There's another term that's used for development, and that is resilience. And I've just asked, have a few points here. Cities have developed new states which are beyond the resilience of their original state. In other words, cities, it's probably impossible for them to resume their original state of either forest or pastures or whatever. They've been well and truly developed past their original state. History shows that some cities have not been able to withstand changes and hence have been abandoned for various reasons, maybe environmental, maybe disasters, sometimes even economic, such as mining. But if you look up the website, there are not a lot of cities that have been abandoned. So there are, most cities seem to be able to survive. Cities require assessment using appropriate measures to predict that an adequate standard of living will be achieved for future generations. And I question this again, what is an adequate standard of living that will ensure living for future generations. So that standard should be sustainable. So the future will be dominated by cities. And this has led to a negative projection for the future of the world's environment by some people. And in the literature, you'll find statements such as, if the majority of the world achieves the same standard of living as the affluent population, global material use will grow 3 to 5 times the current levels. Another statement, in the past 500 years, technological gains have increased environmental impacts by a factor of 1.5. So in other words, technology gains have not reduced the use of materials that humans have used. Creating sustainable cities requires creativity as well as considerable lower levels of consumption. New relationship between humans, energy and materials is required. So that means a paradigm shift that must occur between before a major global crisis occurs. This is certainly the opinion of some people. We don't really know whether this is going to occur because nobody can predict what will happen in the future. Now, a component of the sustainable cities is the amount of green space that's provided. Now, just briefly, the developments in China has been sort of an experiment in a way. The levels of urbanization that have occurred in China have been unprecedented. They've increased from these figures, which I've got from publication. And this is a graph to show the developments. So starting off by 1973, finishing off in this case in 2013. And this depends upon what part of the country you're looking at, but the central region, better put my glasses on. The overall for 57 cities is this red line here. This is the average urban expansion area in square kilometers. So, and it's expanded from about a small figure of a few square kilometers up to now 20 square kilometers over this period. So the prediction is by some people in publications that there will be 70% urbanization in China by 2013. So green space is an essential component of sustainable cities, and leading international cities have targeted the canopy cover, include these cities here, which I've just listed, and they're talking about figures of the 20 to 30% by the near future, and looking even Toronto much further into the future. So the importance of green space, the research papers have shown quite significant developments in this area, and health benefits of green space and tree cover reduces blood pressure, heart rate, and incidence of a number of health risks, and it reduces stress and asthma and provides psychological restoration. And how much green space are we talking about? Minimum level of between half a hectare and 1 hectare, mentioned by several authors. Another author mentions 300 meters minimum linear distance to the boundary of urban green space with a minimum size of 1 hectare. And green space in the end has become recognized as an environmental justice issue. So in the work that I've done, I've adopted a fairly low figure for the recommended level of green space, 15% for CBDs and industrial, 25% for urban residential and light commercial, and 50% for suburban. And I like this quote here: the best friend of the earth on earth of man is the tree, by the well-known architect Frank Lloyd Wright. So the consequences of urban development are fragmentation of ecosystems. This impacts ecosystems functions by decreasing biomass and altering nutrient cycles. And there have been expressed considerable concern by scientists on its effect. So there are synthesis of fragmentation experiments over multiple biomasses and scales, 5 continents, 35 years, by a number of scientists demonstrated that fragmentation reduces biodiversity by something like 13% to 75%. So very significant reductions in the effect due to fragmentation. Now I use some software that's called IndieFrag, which investigates fragmentation of the cities that I've been working with. So status of urban environments: urbanization will be a dominant environmental structure for future generations. Has taken local environments beyond their resilience, as I mentioned, and having done so, resilience is a relevant issue for cities. Cities affect surrounding areas as resources are taken from ever widening areas around cities. So not only is the area covered by the city affected, but areas around the city also. So what I wanted to do was to, having investigated the effect of urbanization in conjunction with some other people in, not Wuhan University, but the Geological Sciences University in Wuhan, where we investigated a number of Landsat scenes to determine the changes in ground cover. In this case, we did a new survey. It was difficult to adapt that one, so we chose a new set of images, which are Landsat, which of course is the only set of images that covers the areas for 30 years. And we wanted to be able to cover into the 1980s. So we downloaded scenes from Wuhan and Sydney. And the reason for choosing Sydney is because there's been a rapid growth in population in the western part of Sydney. So I wanted to investigate what has happened there as well. We used a multi-n-member spectral mixing analysis to derive class fractions for each pixel. And then we determined optimum spectra for all the classes selected from a library based on the minimum n-member average. And then 8 n-members were selected for build-up and vegetation areas, and 5 n-members for soil and water. So the areas we selected were Wuhan, as I mentioned, which is divided into a number of regions, and we investigated just some of them. Also, this is Sydney, and this is western suburbs of Sydney, very widespread because of in a lot of cases, individual houses. And this is, of course, the location of Wuhan and Sydney on the coast. So as I mentioned, we had spectron mixing was implemented to generate class fractions. And then we based our further work on super resolution mapping, where we took a factor of 4 and used a combination of neural networks, neural networks and predicted wavelet method to increase the pixel size to 7.5 meters from the 30 meters of the Landsat. We took care of the shadow and etc. as well. So just briefly, this is a just a flow chart, which I won't go through. I mentioned briefly, this is the actual multispectral analysis, and then super resolution mapping to give us the high resolution images, which were then classified. Classification when accuracy was assessed against, for Wuhan, against high resolution Chinese satellite images. And in Sydney, there's a company called Nearmap that acquires aerial images on a 3 monthly basis. And so we use their images, which is about 2.5 meter resolution. Then we worked out the land use metrics from the IndieFrag software, and then presented the metrics. So this is just examples of the growth of the developments in Wuhan, for example. You can see here much more developments in red here, which is the build-up area, and less of green space. And in Sydney, in the western suburbs, it's perhaps not quite as noticeable, but certainly expansion out into further west from Sydney. And the dominant river, of course, is the Yangtze River that goes through Wuhan, and the Han River also, which junctions in Wuhan. So just as a test, we looked at the relationship between the spectral unmixing method without adding super resolution. So these are the classification of the images based on straight Landsat, and these are the classification images based on the 30 meter, which has been then magnified to super resolution mapping to 7.5 meters. We had some queries about some reviewers about whether this was worthwhile doing, but we felt that there are situations here where some of the features are more visible once we did the super resolution mapping. So the test of accuracy, overall accuracy for the Wuhan areas and Kappa were reasonably high. They weren't quite as high with the Sydney seed because, in fact, Sydney is a lot of developments are based on individual dwellings, and it was difficult sometimes to determine the end members, etc. So accuracy is lower with the Sydney area. So IndieFrag is some software that was developed in Spain, and it works out a lot of metrics, geometric metrics, for example, shape metrics, aggregate metrics, including things like Euclidean nearest neighbor, etc. Shannon diversity, there are something like 30 different metrics that are computed with IndieFrag. There's another software available, so FragStats, that comes out of the USA, but I chose the IndieFrag, which is a little bit easier to implement. So there are figures like this, and the main thing to notice, this is the mean sizes of objects in square meters in Wuhan, in classes, building, soil, vegetation, and water. And I guess the main ones are built-up areas, which is the blue graph here, which have tended to be fairly large in a lot of cases, as against the vegetation, which is some cases, this one here, very, very small areas of vegetation, and over here as well. So quite small areas of vegetation compared with built-up areas. And then I took the ratio of mean size of vegetation over buildings over the period of 30 years. And during that period, Chiaco changed from 50% to 15%. In other words, it started off by vegetation being 50% of the building, but it was reduced to 15%. and Zhanghan also a significant reduction in the size of vegetation. Some of the others, and Wuchang, where the University of Wuhan is, maintained fairly high values. And also I worked out the object density number of areas per square meter. And again, there tended to be emphasis on, in this case, on vegetation. In other words, indicating that vegetation tended to be rather small compared with the building areas. So what happens, in fact, in Wuhan is our earlier paper indicated that it was recognized that over the period up to about in the 2000s, that there had been a significant deterioration in the vegetation in Wuhan. And so there was an increase over that period. So 2009 to 2017, in both those regions here, there was an increase in the level of vegetation. So there was a recognition over that time that there should in fact be improved levels of vegetation and green space in those areas of Wuhan. So Sydney, generally the areas are bigger. This is a number of objects. This is, in fact, there's a lot of bare soil. Because in fact, in part of the time, this period here, there was a severe drought. So there's probably bare soil there and water, but vegetation and building areas here. There was quite a bit in the Blacktown area, which is well developed, but in the Camden area is less developed. And so there was less development of buildings. And I've done the same sort of thing here with looking at the ratio, and overall the ratios have not dropped below, for example, ratio of vegetation objects over building objects not dropped below about 0.5. So overall satisfactory percentages. So discussion about Wuhan, the number of objects showed there have been an increase in the number of building and vegetation objects, but the higher density of vegetation compared with buildings suggests with higher level of fragmentation in vegetation. The reduced ratio object sizes of vegetation to building to 15% or lower in these two regions, Chillicothe and Zhanghan. These districts have the highest density of buildings and while most of the areas of Wuhan satisfy the minimum 15% green space, it appears a couple of them, particularly these two here, do not. And in Sydney, the overall size of building is vegetation significantly larger. The ratios of objects of vegetation building are not less than 50%. The development has had its own consequences, of course, because there are large travel times if employment is in the CBD, and this certainly causes considerable congestion on the roads and the railways because people are living so far away from the city. And obviously that causes increased costs in provision of utilities. So clearly, if one wanted a sustainable city, I don't think you'd be choosing the example of Sydney and probably not the very dense parts of Wuhan, but certainly Wuhan is much more efficient in having more dense populations and therefore facilities for transport, etc. So I'll just mention the Sustainable Development Goals and just mention that some people have been doing quite a bit of work, especially the Joint Research Centre in in Europe, looking at the changes in cities and the number of developments that have occurred in around the world in terms of urban areas. And in fact, they've found that there are more urban areas from this study than have been thought to exist in the past. So this website is quite an interesting one to investigate the global human settlement layer that's been developed by Joint Research Centre now. Okay, so now the last part is equal service values, and they are the assessed values of services to humans brought about by the natural environment, properly functioning ecosystems, and these have been studied extensively for the past 4 decades. And in fact, there's a new journal that was commenced in 2012 with many submissions that have been done and presented. And in fact, this new journal no longer lists the page numbers for the papers because the papers are just given a number. There are so many papers that have been submitted to this new journal on eco-service values. So there was a study done just a few years ago, in China, in this Dongying city, looking at the effect of urban development on eco-service values. And in this case, the researcher assumed that there were no ESVs that were provided by buildings. Now, clearly buildings do provide some sort of service, but whether it's an ecosystem service is another question. This is up to the researchers to consider. But in this particular example, Dongqing increased the buildings by 3.5 times. Green space comprising farmland and grassland was reduced by 29%. And the most significant reduction was in what's called provision of services, which comprises the areas of food production, raw materials. And this was caused by due to losses of grassland, farmland, and water areas. And he even predicted what would happen up till 2025, and the drop-off in ESVs continued. So what I did was take the figures that have been presented, and these are purely, it's a relative estimate here, where I took grassland and rangeland, which came under the heading of vegetation and soil in our study. And the figure that's presented in the papers with $2007, I said it doesn't really matter about the absolute values. It's really the relative measures of taking into account. Lakes and rivers came under the heading of water areas for us, which also had a figure, and buildings. I included a figure for buildings because there's, as I mentioned, it's clearly some sort of contribution to ecosystem services due to buildings, providing shelter, for example, etc. We don't have to list them all. So, but in this case, and really what we're looking at here is the blue one. This is the effect on ecosystem services in Wuhan, brought about by the development of buildings, without considering the contribution of buildings. If I include the contribution of buildings that's up here somewhere. So there's a significant drop off in inconsistent services due to the building in Wuhan. If we don't consider buildings, there's less of an impact if we do take into account buildings to some extent. And for Sydney's concerned, this is one excluding buildings and then including buildings. So not a lot of drop off in the services provided in the Sydney area. The difference between these graphs here, the separation is purely due to the factor of difference in size of the cities. So in summary, I can say the challenge is how the world's population can manage environmental sustainability for an ever-increasing larger urban proportion when certain countries are talking about 70% urbanization. Increasing compactness beyond a certain limit without green space is undesirable for the health and well-being of the population. There's a recognition of the importance of green space should improve the quality of cities, and the figure I gave was a minimum of 15% for CBDs, but larger for areas outside CBD. And parts of Wuhan appear to have reached or maybe have gone beyond a satisfactory limit of compactness. So there's a limit in the reduction in the amount of green space. Finally, I remind you of an earlier statement: sustainability cities require a new relationship between humans, energy, and materials. The challenges for the future: climate change, population growth resulting in greater demands on food and water, resources that humans rely on for their transport, communications, and shelter, which is certainly related to eco services values. And my last slide then says how to assess, the question remains, how to assess the future development of cities to ensure they are sustainable. That's the end of my presentation, so thank you for your attention.